Here's something worth sitting with. The difference between your brain during deep sleep and your brain while you're actively solving a problem may come down to a single variable: how strongly your inhibitory neurons are pushing back. Today, we're exploring a new mathematical model that shows exactly how that push and pull governs whether neurons fire together or apart.
So the brain has a kind of synchrony dial, and inhibition is the hand that turns it.
That's a great way to put it. And today's paper gives us the clearest mathematical picture yet of how that dial actually works. Let's start with what we know about the brain's collective rhythms. Neurons don't just fire randomly, they coordinate. And that coordination swings between two very different modes depending on what you're doing.
Like the brain acts differently when you're asleep versus when you're paying attention to something.
Exactly. During rest or sleep, neuronal activity tends to synchronize. Large populations of neurons fire together in waves. But during active, alert behavior, that synchrony breaks down. The activity becomes desynchronized, more independent, more like a crowd of people all doing their own thing rather than a chorus singing in unison.
And that desynchronized state is actually better for thinking.
For precise, real-time processing of the outside world, yes. The synchronized state seems more tied to rest, memory consolidation, and what happens during sleep. Both states matter, they just serve different purposes.
So what flips the switch between them?
That's the key question. Researchers have known for a while that the difference isn't mainly in the excitatory neurons, the ones that push other neurons to fire. It's in the inhibitory neurons, the ones that put the brakes on. Inhibitory activity and inhibitory synaptic conductance are dramatically different between synchronized and desynchronized states. But how exactly does that change in inhibition translate into a change in collective synchrony? That link was not well understood.
It sounds like a surprisingly basic gap in our knowledge.
It is, and that's what makes this paper interesting. The authors, Satoshi Kuroki and Kenji Mizuseki at Osaka Metropolitan University, decided to tackle it with a mathematical modeling approach, specifically by extending one of the most celebrated models in all of oscillation science. The foundation of this work is something called the Kuramoto model. Think of it as a classic thought experiment in physics and math. You have a bunch of oscillators, imagine metronomes or pendulums, each ticking at its own natural speed, but also nudging each other. If they nudge each other strongly enough, they all start ticking together. That spontaneous synchronization is the phenomenon the Kuramoto model captures.
So in the brain version, the oscillators are neurons.
Conceptually, yes. Each oscillator represents a neuron or a small cluster of neurons, each with its own natural firing rhythm. The interaction between them captures synaptic connections. The original Kuramoto model treats all interactions as the same. Everything attracts everything else toward a common rhythm.
But brains don't work that way. Some neurons excite and some inhibit.
Sharp observation. And that's exactly the gap the authors filled. They created what they call the EI Kuramoto model, EI standing for excitation inhibition. They split the oscillators into two populations. The excitatory group, which they call X units, act as attractors. They pull other oscillators toward the same phase, the same point in the rhythm cycle. The inhibitory group, called In units, act as repellers. They push oscillators away from the shared phase.
So it's like two opposing forces, one pulling everyone into sync and one scattering them apart.
Exactly, and here's what makes the model rich. Instead of just one interaction strength, there are four distinct ones. There's the pull between excitatory units talking to each other, the pull from excitatory units onto inhibitory units, the push from inhibitory units back onto excitatory units, and the push between inhibitory units repelling each other. Each of those four strengths can be tuned independently. The question is, what happens when you change their balance?
That's already more realistic than anything I'd have expected from a simple model.
And yet it remains analytically tractable, which is what makes it elegant. You can actually solve it mathematically, not just simulate it. So how did they actually study this? The work has two major arms: numerical simulation and theoretical analysis.
What does numerical simulation mean in this context?
It means they set the four interactions' strengths to specific values, ran the model on a computer, and watched what happened to the collective behavior of 100 oscillators over time. 80 of those represented excitatory units and 20 were inhibitory, matching the rough biological ratio where about 20% of cortical and hippocampal neurons are inhibitory.
That ratio is actually built into the model from the start. I like that.
It grounds the model in biology without overcomplicating it. To measure synchrony, they tracked something called the order parameter. Think of it as a measure of how tightly aligned all the oscillators are. When the order parameter is close to 1, everyone is marching in step. When it's close to 0, the oscillators are scattered randomly around the clock face of the rhythm cycle.
So a high order parameter means synchronized, and near 0 means desynchronized.
Right, and they computed this separately for the excitatory and inhibitory populations. What they found by sweeping through different combinations of the 4 interaction strengths was 3 qualitatively distinct regimes. One was a stably synchronized state, high order parameter, everyone in lockstep. One was a desynchronized state, low order parameter, everyone scattered. And a third, which they found quite striking, was a bistable state.
Wait, bistable. As in, the system flips back and forth between 2 states.
Exactly. The order parameter alternates rhythmically between high and low. The system synchronizes, then falls apart, then synchronizes again, cycling continuously. It's like a crowd that keeps forming and dissolving spontaneously.
That sounds almost like something between sleep and waking.
The authors make exactly that connection in the discussion. They suggest the bistable state might correspond to a transitional cognitive condition, where related memories can be activated together in waves, potentially facilitating associative thinking or inference. But let me not get ahead of the story. For the theoretical arm, they took a more rigorous approach. Instead of simulating 100 oscillators, they imagined an infinite number of them and described the whole population with a continuous probability density, basically asking, at any given phase in the rhythm cycle, what fraction of oscillators are there? Then they could write equations for how that distribution evolves over time and look for the conditions under which it stays uniform. That's desynchrony versus when it clumps up, that's synchrony.
So instead of tracking individual metronomes, you track the shape of the crowd.
A perfect analogy. And from that mathematical analysis, they could derive precise conditions for bifurcation, the tipping points where the system crosses from one regime to another. Let's talk about what they actually found. The simulations confirmed 3 distinct states, and more importantly, showed how those states depend on the 4 interaction strengths in a structured, predictable way.
Which parameter matters most?
The inhibitory strengths turn out to be the critical drivers of state transitions. When the strength of repulsion among the inhibitory units themselves is increased, the system shifts toward desynchronization. And when the push from inhibitory units back onto excitatory units is increased, the system also desynchronizes.
So more inhibition in almost any direction pushes the brain out of sync.
Generally, yes. Conversely, when excitatory to excitatory attraction is the dominant force, the system locks into a synchronized state. The bistable state arises in an intermediate regime where excitatory pull and inhibitory push are more evenly matched, and the theoretical analysis revealed a specific balance condition. The bistable regime requires the product of the 2 cross-interaction strengths to exceed the product of the 2 within-group strengths.
That's an interesting result. It's not just about which force is bigger, it's about a multiplicative relationship.
Right, and that's genuinely non-obvious. It means that even weak within-group interactions can allow a bistable regime if both cross-interaction strengths are moderate, because what matters is the multiplicative balance across the whole architecture, not any single parameter in isolation.
And the theoretical analysis predicted all 3 states accurately.
Yes, and they tested this with a particularly elegant simulation. They let the inhibitory strength vary sinusoidally over time, slowly cycling up and down like a wave, and watched how the system responded. As the inhibitory strength rose, the system moved through synchronized, then bistable, then desynchronized states, and as it fell, it returned through those same states in reverse. The theoretical boundaries between states, calculated from the math, match the simulation transitions with impressive accuracy, with only small timing discrepancies near the transition boundaries.
So the math actually predicted the simulation. That's rare and satisfying.
It means the model is not just descriptive, it has genuine predictive power. And the fact that the infinite oscillator theory worked for a finite system of 100 units suggests the framework is robust across scales. Let's dig into the mechanism of the bistable state, because that's the most counterintuitive of the three. Why does the system oscillate between synchrony and disorder rather than settling into one or the other?
Yeah, how does that self-sustaining loop happen?
Here's the sequence. The excitatory units start clustering together at one phase position. They attract both themselves and the inhibitory units toward that common point. But as the inhibitory units get dragged closer to the same phase, something changes. Their repulsive force suddenly has teeth.
Why does being closer make their repulsion stronger?
When the inhibitory units are scattered randomly, their pushes cancel each other out. They're pointing in all directions. But when they cluster near the same phase as the excitatory units, their repulsion becomes coordinated and coherent. At some tipping point, the collective repulsive force from the now clustered inhibitory units overwhelms the attractive force holding the excitatory units together.
Oh, so by getting closer, the inhibitory units actually gather more power to push back.
Exactly, the excitatory units then scatter. Their collective synchrony collapses, and as they scatter, they lose the ability to keep pulling the inhibitory units together, so the inhibitory units scatter too. Then the excitatory units drift and eventually recluster at some new phase position, and the whole sequence repeats. It's a self-defeating synchrony. The very act of synchronizing sets up the conditions that destroy it.
That's almost poetic. The thing that creates order also creates disorder.
And it maps onto something real in the brain. The authors point out that this kind of correlated excitatory and inhibitory activity, where both populations tend to be active at the same time, is actually observed experimentally in the biological brain. It's not just a model artifact.
What does this mean for understanding cognition and brain disease?
The three states map onto a recognizable spectrum. Strong synchronization resembles states seen in deep sleep or pathologically in epilepsy, where excitation-inhibition balance is broken. The desynchronized state aligns with active, alert processing when the brain needs to respond precisely to external information. And the bistable middle ground may correspond to a condition that enables associative memory and creative inference, where the brain connects stored patterns rather than processing new input. Beyond cognition, the model points toward neurological disorders. The authors mention that disruptions to inhibitory interneuron function, as seen in schizophrenia, or the wholesale collapse of excitation-inhibition balance, as in epilepsy, could be understood as the system being pushed out of its optimal regime. The E.I. Kuramoto model doesn't explain those diseases, but it offers a mathematical vocabulary for thinking about what goes wrong.
And the authors are clear that this is a simplified starting point, not a complete model of the brain.
Very clear about that. They acknowledge that real synaptic connections are sparse and unevenly distributed, that inhibitory neurons are far more diverse than the model captures, and that the effects of synaptic input depend heavily on timing in ways the model doesn't yet include. The next step, they suggest, is incorporating those biological details and validating against actual neural recordings.
So what's the single biggest surprise you take away from this paper?
That in a model of just 100 oscillators with 4 tunable interaction strengths, you can reproduce all 3 major brain synchrony states, synchronized, bistable, and desynchronized, simply by adjusting the balance of inhibition. And the bistable state, the one where the brain rhythmically flickers between order and disorder, turns out to be the natural outcome of a specific multiplicative balance between excitatory and inhibitory cross-connections.
A flickering brain state as a mathematical necessity, not a bug, but a feature of the excitation-inhibition architecture.
If I had to put today's discovery in one sentence, the brain's ability to cycle spontaneously between synchrony and chaos is baked into the math of excitation-inhibition balance, and inhibition is the single knob that moves you across all three states.
That reframes a lot of what we think about rest, sleep, and the transitions between them.
Today's paper is Excitation-Inhibition Balance Controls Synchronization in a Simple Model of Coupled Phase Oscillators by Satoshi Kuroki and Kenji Mizuseki, published in Neural Computation in 2025. Thank you for listening to Oskai Pod.
Thanks everyone, see you next time.